Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about the UFC 290 main event. And UFC and MMA isn't a sport that I always commentate on. Usually, of course, I end up talking about boxing or that of the tennis circuit or at times NBA basketball. But every once in a while, when it's a fight that I think is worth commentating on or a fighter worth commentating on, in this case, Alexander Volkanovski, I think that, of course, is sometimes worth to talk about. Alexander Volkanovski, of course, for those of you that are not familiar with him, maybe for those of you that don't watch the MMA scene, Alexander Volkanovski was able to beat that of Yair Rodriguez, who I believe was another contender that he had to face against in that of the featherweight division. In terms of MMA, that's 145 pounds, I believe. And I believe he was able to make his fifth title defense. And not only was he able to beat Yair Rodriguez, but I believe that with his fifth title defense that he is starting to break certain records. Now, I believe when we talk about the most amount of title defenses in terms of the UFC's featherweight history, I believe that it still belongs to that of Jose Aldo. I think Jose Aldo might even have like 9 title defenses. Not always in terms of the UFC, because earlier on, I believe he was a part of a different promotion called the WEC, which would eventually merge with that of the UFC. But the fact that he was also able to defend that in terms of UFC, one could legitimately debate that Jose Aldo has a legitimate 9 title defenses, because a lot of the fighters that he was fighting would eventually, once again, merge with that of the UFC, because I believe the WEC would eventually merge with that of the UFC. And Jose Aldo held that title of the best featherweight in the world for pretty much a decade, I believe, if I remember correctly. But many people now taking a look at Alexander Volkanovski with his wins over Max Holloway, Brian Ortega, Yair Rodriguez, and of course he was able to push the students of that of the Russian Sambo, Dagestan wrestling school system. He was able to push him to his max limits, and in many people's imagination, he was able to just pull out that fight. I don't think that he did. I thought that he blew that fight and lost it 2 rounds to 3, in my personal opinion, against Islam Makhachev. But the fact that he was able to push him so hard in the first place, a fighter that really dominated Charles de Bronx Oliveira, someone who was a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu specialist and a guy that, handled Justin Gaethje and Michael Chandler with relative ease, at least Justin Gaethje. And of course, he was also able to submit Dustin Poirier. The fact that Alexander Volkanovski was able to go up to 155 and really challenge him and almost win the fight shows you the level and the caliber of fighter that Volkanovski is. But I wanted, of course, to talk about the whole picture in this fight. I didn't just want to talk about the fight, but I also wanted to talk about, is Alexander Volkanovski debatably the greatest featherweight that the UFC has ever seen, at least in my personal view? And if he's not the greatest UFC featherweight that the UFC has ever seen, is he personally the best or the most talented? And I thought that I would talk about that here. But first of all, let's talk about this fight between that of Alexander Volkanovski and Yair Rodriguez. Rodriguez, of course, is a fighter that even several years ago, he was getting a lot of buzz because of his very interesting knockouts and his taekwondo/karate style. Personally, in my view, I was never a huge fan of that of Yair Rodriguez's fighting style. He's another one of these fighters that, in my view, kind of like that of a Johnny Walker or certain other fighters like that, even to a certain degree, Anthony Pettis, they throw a lot of these kicks or they throw a lot of these one-shot strikes that, they think they'll land because they think they're in a kung fu movie or something like that. But in reality, that's not how you win fights. Now, don't get me wrong, Anthony Pettis is above a certain, level of fighter than that of a Yair Rodriguez, because Anthony Pettis at one point in time was actually able to win the belt. But his striking limitations would eventually be somewhat exposed against a better fighter in that of Rafael dos Anjos, a fighter that pretty much was able to beat him from pillar to post in that potential fight. For those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, watch that fight. But anyways, to get back on track, Yair Rodriguez has been a fighter that, he's been a relatively good fighter. And he was, of course, able to improve his fighting style within that of the past couple years. Did I ever believe that Yair Rodriguez was going to beat Alexander Volkanovski? No. And Yair was able to give it a couple of competitive moments, especially within that of the third round. I even think that at one point in time, I think this was in the second round, he landed a very good right cross against Alexander Volkanovski that ended up stunning him a little bit. But Yair Rodriguez is a fighter to where he's a very good fighter, but he's never going to be a great one. And the reason why that is, once again, is pretty much because of his fighting style. He cannot really beat you in a multitude of ways. Now, of course, he has a very good taekwondo slash karate style when you talk about, his kicks and, his strikes. But he's another one of these fighters that, once again, it almost looks like he believes he's in a kung fu movie where he thinks that, these singular strikes or these singular kicks, that they're going to win you the fight. And that's just not real life. One thing that my father always personally taught me when it came to that, whether I was training in MMA or that of boxing, and I usually trained a lot more in boxing than that of MMA. But one thing he always told me, especially when it came to certain guys that train in Taekwondo and karate, is that you have to throw certain things in combination. Because if you throw too many kicks just one at a time, or if you throw too many punches one at a time, eventually you're going to become a little bit too predictable. And Yair Rodriguez is one of those fighters. He's one of these guys that a lot of the times throws a lot of these winding kicks or, throws a lot of these, lunging kicks. And a lot of the times it just doesn't land or it doesn't work out for him. He might be able to land them against lesser caliber competition, but there's a reason why he's never legitimately held a UFC title. And I don't count the UFC interim title as a legitimate belt. I just don't. Pretty much what that belt says is that I'm definitely the second best in my weight division. And as we all know, Yair Rodriguez and the interim champion, you are not the legitimate champion if you are the interim champion. It just is what it is. And Volkanovski, his ground game, of course, proved to be way too much also for Yair Rodriguez. He's always proved to be a little bit of a limited fighter on the ground. Now, he was able to do decently well, I believe, against Josh Emmett and a couple of other fighters. He may have even possibly caused Brian Ortega's arm or shoulder, I believe, to be dislocated in their fight. I would have to rewatch that fight, but Volkanovski is just too good of a fighter. He is too good of jiu-jitsu, too good of wrestling, and just really too complete of a game in the first place to really be beat by someone that, in my view, is a relatively one-dimensional fighter in Yair Rodriguez. And that's not me saying that he's necessarily one-dimensional in his abilities, but he's one-dimensional in his fighting tactics. Once again, when you take away some of those kicks from that of Yair Rodriguez and you put an elite-level boxer in terms of that of Alexander Volkanovski against that of someone like that of Yair Rodriguez, and when I say elite-level boxer, I'm not talking about quote-unquote the Diaz brothers level of boxing, which really compared to actual boxing is very subpar. I'm talking about a guy who actually relatively has very good counters, very good mid-range and long-range game, and of course his long reach for his size helps with that. His reach is almost that of 6 feet for a guy that's 5'6". That's pretty incredible when you talk about, his reach to high proportions. When it comes down to it, he has very decently lengthy arms. But at the end of the day, Volkanovski, he's just too intelligent to lose to a fighter, in my view, like that of Yair Rodriguez. Yair Rodriguez, at the end of the day, is way too predictable. If you're going to beat an elite level champion, you have to show them that you can beat them in a multitude of ways. You don't even necessarily have to be extraordinarily great on the ground, although, of course, that would help. But Yair Rodriguez, in my view, doesn't even have necessarily a multitude of fighting tactics on that of the feet. It just is what it is. Once again, he throws a lot of these kicks or a lot of these strikes. A lot of the times he'll go for the legs or he'll go for the body. And then after that, he'll throw a 1-2 or a good one punch right after that. And at the end of the day, to beat an elite level champion, you can't just do that. You have to be a multi-dimensional fighter. You have to have a multitude of game plans and more than likely a multitude of styles of fighting. Yair Rodriguez has never had that. He's never had that. It just is what it is. But anyways, Volkanovski proved once again that he pretty much is clearly the best featherweight in the world. Now, if I were going to possibly say that if there was one fighter that could potentially challenge that of Alexander Volkanovski of the 145-pound division, I really don't see any other possible answer than that of that one kid, I believe, who wanted Paddy Pimblett, Topuria, that one Georgian Spanish mixed kid. That kid can fight his ass off. He has legitimate boxing ability, especially for that of an MMA fighter. He's very good on the ground. Now, Volkanovski, because he's so girthy, even for that weight division, you would have to wonder how well would Topuria actually be able to fight against Volkanovski on the ground or even be able to handle his power or size. But if there's one kid or one fighter at that weight division that has a chance, is Topuria. It's not going to be Max Holloway. He also, in my view, was always a little bit too limited as a fighter, and that's why Max lost a lot of the bigger fights in his career against fighters that could actually handle his size and his proportions and his skill set, aka Dustin Poirier, aka that of Alexander Volkanovski. Max Holloway is really a fighter with his height and his dimensions that really should be fighting at 155, but he's probably not going to do that because I'm not really sure how many fights he would win there. But it is what it is. Anyways, just to continue it onward, Volkanovski pretty much proved my point about him being the better fighter than that of Yair Rodriguez. But now let's get to the meat and potatoes of the conversation. What is the case for Volkanovski debatably being the greatest featherweight of all time? Do I personally believe that he is the greatest featherweight of all time? I don't necessarily know if I can say that he's the greatest featherweight that I've ever seen, because greatest would also say that he has the same level of accomplishments. But I certainly, would somewhat see why certain people believe that case. He certainly, in my view, debatably is the most skilled and the most talented fighter that I've ever seen there. And of course, that's saying a lot because you've had certain fighters there like Max Holloway, Conor McGregor, Jose Aldo, a lot of great talents over the years. Frankie Edgar, even though, of course, he was not ever able to win the belt there. At the moment, in terms of greatest, I would probably still give the nod to that of Jose Aldo for beating so many top-tier contenders, all the way from Uriah Faber to, I believe, Frankie Edgar to a multitude of other contenders over the years. And of course, Conor was very decently talented as well, but he never defended the belt even once there, so I can't necessarily say that he's the greatest there. And Max Holloway, even though in my view, as great of a fighter as he is, in my view, he was always a little bit overrated, especially in terms of his skill set. Just my personal view of it. But Volkanovski, in my view, if not the first best featherweight or the first greatest featherweight, he certainly would be the second in my personal view. And Volkanovski, just in my view, he also would probably be the most talented featherweight that I've personally ever seen there. Just my view. He has very good striking ability, both with his legs and his hands. He can beat you in a multitude of ways on the stand-up. He can also beat you on that of the ground. On top of that, he has excellent athleticism. He has very good wrestling ability. It seems that he has very good jiu-jitsu as well, even though it appears that he trains a little bit more with that of the wrestling ability. Volkanovski is just a tough guy that is just a tough guy because he's such a complete fighter. And that's why even at 155, Islam Makhachev, who is a student of the game of Abid Nurmagomedov, and that's Sambo wrestling over there in Dagestan, those fighters are basically looked at in some realms as untouchable. Volkanovski was even able to challenge Islam Makhachev to almost losing that fight. For his first fight there in the UFC, I believe at 155. So once again, that goes to show you how complete of a fighter he actually is. The fact that he was able to outstrike certain guys like Max Holloway, Jose Aldo, deal with the wrestling of Chad Mendes, even though he was a bit older, deal with the wrestling and a little bit of the striking of Islam Makhachev. Alexander Volkanovski certainly is a great fighter, one of the greatest fighters that the UFC has ever seen. Now, where does he rank all time in my view? I don't think that I would quite put him top 10 yet, but I'll say this. If you were to put him top 20 or top 30, I would not be able to be angry at that at all. I think that he certainly has a better case being up there than that of Max Holloway in my view, and possibly even Conor McGregor, just my personal view of it. Now, Conor might also have a great case debatably being top 20 of all time, just because during his prime, he was the two-weight division champion, and he defeated some great names on his resume. But at the end of the day, Volkanovski, I would probably say that as a prime fighter, he's probably even more complete than that of Conor McGregor, even possibly with that of the striking ability. He's that great of a fighter. He has excellent counter-punching ability on both the back foot and the front foot. Excellent mid-range, excellent long range. He can fight going backwards. He can fight going forwards. He can wrestle with you. He's a threat, pretty much in every dimension. And that's what a real championship caliber fighter truly is. Truly is. So Volkanovski, once again, deserves a lot of credit. And debatably, in my view, one could seriously have a debate that out of all the lower weight class fighters, and when I talk about lower weight class fighters, I'm talking about from the featherweight downwards, all the way from featherweight to flyweight, that he is debatably the most talented lighter weight fighter of all time, even more than that of Dominic Cruz, even more debatably than that of Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson, even though he's right there with anybody, even more than that of Henry Cejudo. You can debate in a serious matter that he's more talented than any of those fighters. TJ Dillashaw, you can have a serious debate that he is debatably more talented than some of those fighters. He is as complete, if not even more complete, than some of those other fighters. Just put my opinion out there. But anyways, what is the fight that I would like to see Alexander Volkanovski in next? If not the Islam Makhachev rematch, I would love to see that maybe of a Dustin Poirier or Justin Gaethje fight, depending on who may win that fight, or maybe the winner of Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler. I would love to see one of those fights because that would really test his striking, at that weight division, and to see if he can handle that level of power. Dustin Poirier is another guy that has great boxing ability. That would be a toss-up fight in my view. And then of course you have Justin Gaethje, who has a little bit of boxing ability, but is just gets hit way too much. But he has great power and great leg work. When it comes down to it, when I say that, of course I mean that of leg kicks. And of course the winner of Conor and Michael Chandler, that might be a great introduction into reintroducing himself to that of the 155-pound weight division. So I'd love to see any one of those fights if the Islam Makhachev fight does not happen next. Or who knows, maybe even Charles de Bronx Oliveira. So we'll see what happens. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. I just thought that I would talk about that. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you thought. And that's really about it. But very special fighter that Alexander Volkanovski is. Very special fighter indeed. We'll see where he goes from here. But I don't see him unless it's Ilir Topuria, I believe. I believe that that's the kid's name, that Spanish and Georgian kid. Unless it's him, I don't really see anyone having a relative chance at the 145-pound division. I just don't, in my personal view. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. I just thought that I would talk about that. I don't usually talk about MMA quite as often, but I thought that I would talk about this for a multitude of reasons. Would give me a little bit of a breakdown of this fight that I thought was an interesting contrast of the styles. And on top of that, to talk about Alexander Volkanovski, who in my view is debatably the number one pound-for-pound fighter at the moment. I would probably say John Jones, but if there's a definitive number two, one could certainly debate Alexander Volkanovski. And if he is able to beat Islam Makhachev, one certainly could debate that he is number one. Because, no offense to Ciryl Gane, but Ciryl Gane kind of went out like a punk in that fight against John Jones. I mean, that fight should have lasted at least a couple rounds. But so I do have to wonder, is Ciryl Gane really as good as certain people try to promote him to be? Maybe he is, because he was able to beat, certain guys like that of Derek Lewis and a couple of other very decent contenders, But to be fair, he also lost the two most important fights of his life. So I don't know. But anyways, I'll give John a lot of credit. I think John Jones right now would probably be my number one pound-for-pound fighter. But if you were to debate Alexander Volkanovski, I would understand. But I just think that John Jones's resume and the depth of his record, I'd probably still go with John Jones. But, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.